Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, coming to you on a really busy week. We're starting to cross that bridge right now between the summer off season and the preseason across college football. And that always a mile marker in that journey is heading over to Indianapolis for the Big Ten Football Media Days event. Myself, Mark Brennan will be doing that. We both have flights scheduled for Tuesday. We'll both be sticking out there for a few days. 18 conference members now represented out there. James Franklin, 3 different Penn State players, athletic director Pat Kraft making the trip on behalf of Penn State University here. We got a lot to dissect, look forward to. We also just recently got a peek at Penn State basketball practice, some newcomers on the court, some veterans who've come along in their second season with the second-year coaching staff. So we'll do a little bit of a progress report from the hardwood for Penn State hoops later on. But without further ado, we bring back on my colleagues, Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan from Lions247.com. For those watching at home, I'm still getting situated with the at-home studio spot as I get in a new house. We'll be coming to you actually from Indianapolis, Mark and I, with episode 2 this week. And Daniel, we had hoped that you'd be joining us. We had planned on you joining us, but a family situation came up. Some things are bigger than football. Some things are bigger than this beat, obviously. So glad you can tend to those. We'll handle business in Indy. You'll do some stuff remotely, but glad to get you guys on board for as I said in the intro there, Mark, this is always a spot on the calendar where you feel like you're taking another step forward after, a July that doesn't have a lot of events on that calendar.
Yeah, this is where the whole Pac-12, Big Ten thing is becoming real, right? I mean, it's kind of, this is the first event where everybody is going to be there. The other thing about this week that I always like is the availability of Pat Kraft. We only get him a couple times a year, typically at the bowl game and then at this event. So he's going to be available late Tuesday afternoon, and we'll have complete coverage of that. There's a lot of questions, obviously, for Pat. And then just to get back into, we've actually been around Franklin and the staff a lot during the summer camp season, but not a lot of opportunities to ask, interview type questions and that sort of thing. So being able to talk to him and then a few of the players is going to be good. But yeah, this is definitely a milestone. This is when the craziness starts. And in our situation, the craziness is actually a good thing because that's when, we get things done during the year.
Daniel, this is a chance to speak with a few of the leaders in the locker room. What do you make of the 3 members of the team that Penn State's sending out there that we'll get a chance to get face-to-face with in Indy?
I think that the 3 guys that are going out there, Tyler Warren, Devon J. Thomas, formerly known as Devon Elise, and Jalen Reed, I think that that's a very good sampling of where you can kind of sense some of this leadership coming from. I've talked about it before with Tyler Warren, where we saw him out front a lot in Atlanta at the Peach Bowl. I talked to Ty Howell earlier this summer, and he said that Warren is, they're kind of pushing him to be a little bit more in front of the team, a little bit more into a leadership role. And it's something that Warren, I think, has taken to a little bit. I think he still strikes me as more of a lead by example type of guy, but also when he speaks, guys listen. Devon, we've known for years the kind of charisma that he has, the way that he handles himself in front of a crowd, kind of that personality. I feel like the past couple of years he's come up as someone who's been a leader in that locker room. And I think that this is the type of environment where he can really thrive. I think that, as an aside, another thing I'm interested in is kind of getting the temperature of how other beats feel about Penn State. And you can tell that by, are there a lot of Ohio State, Michigan State writers, Oregon writers, USC writers, are they coming around to talk to the Penn State guys? And, I think that if those writers go and they end up talking to Devon, he's going to fill up their notebook and, give them an impression of the personality of Penn State. And then Jalen Reed, he's someone who I think is kind of, he's been in the same room as Shaquan Brisker and Jair Brown, Keaton Ellis even. So I feel like, for someone who's in his 4th year and has played a lot of football and has played at a pretty high level, he still kind of strikes me as someone who's still a little bit under the radar a little bit, especially in the Big Ten wide sense. So I think having Reed out there, is the opportunity. He's someone who has always struck me as really honest and, someone who can really, give you some insight So I think between those three guys, you've got leaders, you've got guys with personality, and you've got guys that can really give you some insight.
And Jalen Reed is somebody that had honorable mention label last year in that postseason accolades across the conference. I don't know if that sit really all that well with him, considering the level of performance that defense put out there, his role within that defense. And we'll get into this kind of what we want to dive into with each of those three players in a moment here. But Mark, you have covered all sorts of different settings for the Big Ten football media days. It's made a bit of a home here in Indy during recent years. I know you and I were out in Chicago the first year we covered it together during a big time heat wave. But what is the significance of this? Because we will see James Franklin as part of that kind of car wash, the rotation of coaches that will make their way to the podium briefly, field questions from kind of more of a national field of reporters. And then eventually you'll see James Franklin and what will be a more heavy dose of Penn State specific beat reporters we anticipate in Indy. And that'll be more lengthy. There'll be these players, but you're also kind of trying to keep your eye on the peripheral, what's happening across the conference. So to you, what makes this unique? I'd imagine just this influx of some pedigreed programs in college football, USC Trojans, Oregon Ducks. Is it more than that, though?
Well, first of all, it's giving the old thumbs down because they moved this from Chicago to Indy during COVID. Completely understandable. Put it in Lucas Oil Stadium. I also almost called it the RCA, whatever it was, but Lucas Oil Stadium. And, they've kept it there. And it doesn't kind of resonate with me the way that Chicago did. They would move it around to different areas of Chicago, and you're there in the city, and that's kind of like the heart of the Midwest. And I just wish they would kind of move it back there. Another thing I wanted to bring up, and this is kind of doesn't have anything to do with what you asked me about, but when we talk about these players who are going to be there, Penn State, since Franklin took over, has only had seniors academically. And that's why you never saw a Christian Hackenberg or Saquon Barkley or I'm trying to think of who else. Well, this year, obviously, no Drew Aller or Nick Singleton or Abdul Carter. So that's what they've done. That's the way they've decided to go about it. Some people aren't happy about it. I'm fine with it. I mean, these guys have been in the program a long time. You've talked about it, Daniel, and Tyler. All three of these guys are going to represent themselves very well. But it's an opportunity, Tyler, getting back to your original question, to get a feel for what everybody thinks around the Big Ten. Part of this is being there for the interviews, but part of it is also, BSing with other reporters and catching up with people who cover all of these different teams. And one of the really cool things about this is, we work remotely. We're part of the 24/7 Sports Network, but this is an opportunity every year to get to see the people that we work with virtually all the time. So when we're doing a game week preview and you bring somebody on who covers the opposing team onto the podcast, Sam Webb from Michigan or whoever it might be, Steve Hellwagon from Ohio State. It's good to be able to touch base with these people and for the people that we work for. It's just, for me, it's just a great opportunity to connect on a lot of different levels. So yeah, a big part of it is doing Penn State interviews, but we could wait till Penn State Media Day to do a lot of that. Being able, number one, to talk to Kraft, and then to be able to network and talk to people and get kind of a feel for what's going on around the conference, I think is a really good thing. So I know I went on pretty long there, but I've been to a lot of these. I always enjoy covering them. Just always liked Chicago a little bit better than Indy.
Mark brought up a couple points there, one of which is that this is very much a light appetizer before the huge entree that we have ahead of us. First Saturday of August, we're anticipating Penn State preseason media day over at Beaver Stadium, which if you followed our coverage in the past, we get a chance to see a lot, hear from a lot of different people in a relatively short span of time. So stay tuned for that coverage coming down the road as we begin August. And the other note here, all three of those guys who went last year, and I'm sure if we worked our way back in previous years that Penn State has assembled these lists for the Big Ten Media Days. But those guys were all captains, eventually named captains. Olu Fashanu, Keaton Ellis, Adiza Isaac were out there representing Penn State last year. We don't know a single captain, which I feel like the last couple of years we've maybe known 3 by the time we've gotten to this point. Coming out of spring ball, there's been some early announcement. And James Franklin just said there's not really quite that consensus there for guys to be able to outright name them captains right now, which is compelling in some ways. And so, but these 3 names, I think you circle them because of their selection on this list. And Daniel, you said a lot of this is about seeing how Big Ten teams feel about each other, how these beats feel about other Big Ten teams or their own squads. I know I was on a conversation today with somebody. They wanted kind of a perspective from someone who's here on campus and covers the team. We'll get a chance to pick the minds of those who cover Ohio State, Michigan, USC, and what have you. What do you think right now is the external perspective in Indianapolis that we're going to encounter regarding the Nittany Lions? Because right now it sure seems like they're in their typical status of being on that next tier, right below the teams that are considered the true heavyweights here in 2024.
Yeah, I think the one thing that other people are going to want to know about Penn State, which I think is something that we also want to know and that the fan base wants to know, is can they kind of break through that 10-2 cap that's been on them? Will the expanded playoff, will they finally break through because of that and get into the postseason? I think that those are 2 things that from the outside, looking in at Penn State, I think are pretty compelling. I think that a lot of people that are going to be there would probably like the chance to talk to Drew Aller and Nick Singleton and Abdul Carter about what's next for them and what they think they can accomplish this year. But I just think that that's going to be the central question, because a lot of people that are there have followed Penn State for a long time and they kind of know where this program stands. And so is that going to change this year? We saw a couple preseason polls come out this morning that are unofficial. The Big Ten doesn't do its own preseason media poll, and both of them had Penn State slotted in at number 3 behind Ohio State at number 1 and Oregon at number 2. Michigan was at number 4. And so, is that's kind of where Penn State's been these past couple of years. Usually it's Ohio State and Michigan above them, but can they kind of break through? Can they take that next step? Can Drew Aller raise his game to be the type of quarterback that a lot of people are expecting to see, the kind that can elevate a program? I think that's, from the outside, I think that's going to be the, maybe a central focus on this Penn State team in Indianapolis.
Yeah, everyone wants to know about what Drew Aller is going to take that step forward and what he's going to look like, and especially in those big moments and the impact of Andy Kotelnicki. There's a lot of things that could be thrown in the direction of James Franklin in Indianapolis, and there's always some curveballs to be learned over the course of questioning out there. But Mark, when it comes to getting the chance to sit there in front of James Franklin, those opportunities are pretty limited for us over the course of the entire year. So what are you most curious about here in the preseason press conference setting that we'll get with James on Wednesday?
Yeah, just to be clear, because I don't want people to get the wrong impression, they're limited for us in the off season. During the season, we have every opportunity to talk to them. So I just wanted to be clear on that.
We'll be getting up close and personal with James on a weekly basis from now through Thanksgiving, actually through Christmas, really, moving forward. But we're at the end of our summer coverage, and so this is a chance again to peel back the curtain a little bit, as much as to let us, before we get into that preseason setting.
Yeah, number one, you always have to check on personnel. I mean, have there been any changes, kind of in this period where we haven't had an opportunity to talk to people? Guys left the team, academic problems, whatever, may come up. I'm also anxious to talk about kind of the camaraderie on the coaching staff. You bring in 2 new coordinators. I don't know that he would admit it, but clearly there was an issue on that front with one of the coordinators last year, because I don't think you fire a coordinator in November if everything's hunky-dory, as they used to say back in Hazleton. So I think that's a big part of it. And then I think you touched on something, Tyler, a little bit earlier. The leadership of this team. That could be so cliche, but where is it going to come from, and why is it taking so long to kind of appoint these captains? My guess is, in just looking at this team and kind of knowing, you don't have those big dynamic personalities like a Sean Clifford, a Michael Robinson back in the day. I think this is more of a lead by example group, and I wonder if it's more kind of spread out across the board. So I don't think it's actually a negative thing. I think that could be effective leadership. But Daniel had mentioned it. Devon Elise, of the guys coming out here, is really the one guy who's kind of charismatic. Tyler Warren is definitely low key. Jalen Reed, as you mentioned, sometimes he says a little bit too much, but he's just not like outgoing and effervescent and that sort of thing. So where are who is somebody going to emerge kind of in those roles? And then, I know it's been beaten to death. Franklin was asked about it twice, the same question after the blue-white game, or I think it was. But, I mean, the receiving situation, we were wondering if they were going to do something in the portal to maybe beef this up, and was something going to come along, a grad transfer, whatever. But, just kind of where does that stand? And I think those are the things that kind of just, thinking about it off the top of my head, that kind of stand out to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably an appropriate time to ask about the plan of attack during the offseason, because this is the roster that we're going to see this team work with. I mean, there's not really any open-ended circumstances that we're waiting to see if they pick up a transfer receiver here and add them to the mix. And you can kind of go across the roster right now that they've had a chance, looking back, what's the hindsight? What were the lessons learned? How do they feel about that kind of stuff? Daniel, although we won't have you out there physically, what would be kind of at the top of your list in terms of picking the mind of James Franklin here as it gets later in July?
Yeah, I think I am still really curious as to how the coordinator synergy is going. You've got 3 new coordinators. I know that special teams doesn't get the most attention when it comes to that, especially with Andy Kotelnicki there and Tom Allen. But I think merging together, 3 new people in pretty prominent and important positions on the coaching staff is notable. I think that the way that James Franklin has built this staff, you've got a lot of guys who have been around for a long time and have strong voices. Guys like Terry Smith, Jaywan Sider, Anthony Poindexter. So I think you have a good infrastructure for new coordinators to come in and have stability around them that they can work within. But I am still really curious as to what that's going to look like. You start the year at West Virginia and you don't have that ramp up period that maybe you had in an earlier era of college football. I mean, you're not going to have Idaho to put 79 points on in week 1. And so, how do you make sure that you're hitting the ground running, in Morgantown? I know, Tyler, we talked about it, I think on a past podcast, where what happens if those first 2 series in Morgantown are 3 and out, for that Penn State offense? What does that look like? What does that do? How is that, received on social media and within college football at large? Penn State needs to be ready to go. And so you've got all these new pieces on the coaching staff. I mean, overall, the roster is pretty similar to what we saw last year at times. So, how do you get these coaches, these new schemes? How do you make sure that's all ready to go week 1? I think that's something that really stands out to me that, kind of goes back to James Franklin.
It can be a little tricky getting insight in this kind of a setting on where guys are from a medical perspective. But in terms of availability, as August comes up, perhaps we'll get to shed a little bit of light on the likes of Alonzo Ford, the defensive tackle who transferred in last year from Old Dominion, hurt early in preseason camp, out for the season, out for the spring. Jackson Smolik, the redshirt freshman quarterback, injured during spring ball. Keon Wiley, a redshirt sophomore linebacker, injured during spring ball. Zariah Fisher, a redshirt senior defensive end, injured during spring ball. So again, no promises that we'll get some kind of clarity there, but these are some of the lingering roster notes that we have written down as we head out to Indianapolis and we start to learn more about the Nittany Lions. talking about these three guys and specifically, I think Jalen Reed, again, I think he feels like he can really have a coming out party this year. I think he did in a lot of ways for us who covered the team locally last year. But to me, the guy, and you mentioned it because of how his personality really is, the way he's hardwired. He didn't have social media accounts during his recruitment process. Tyler Warren. This is a guy who has really emerged on the scene as a tight end to know at the national level. Theo Johnson talked about NFL coaching staffs picking his brain about Tyler Warren because they know, he's that next man up coming from Penn State. And here we are yet again where we discuss a position that just lost an NFL talent, and yet we're not circling it and saying this is going to be a problem. Part of that is what they have bubbling up to the surface from younger components of this roster, guys like Andrew Rapplier, Khalil Dinkins. But, Mark, there is a real belief, and you wrote about this not too long ago at Lions247.com, that Warren can establish himself as one of those names that last in tight end lore at Penn State. But I think he can start to really show off who he is a little bit, because they're going to put him through the ringer in this media setting. He's going to have to open up a bit, and I think he's ready to do that. In some conversations we've had earlier this year, I feel like not only is he getting more verbal, more vocal as a leader within this locker room, which is a necessity as he becomes an older member of it, but I think he's really getting more comfortable talking about himself, but even more so talking about the brand of Penn State football and representing it. And I think he's more comfortable talking about the 100 other guys in the roster, the coaching staff, all the work that goes in on the Lash building than he is about himself. And that's probably going to show up in some of these interviews this week. I just think he's the guy that a lot of fans, a lot of people who just don't know much about him are going to exit this week and feel like they got a better understanding of who Warren is.
Well, that's kind of the last step in his development, right? I mean, other than staying healthy, because that's been the only thing that's kind of held him back here. But if you look at the guys he's been in the room with, in Brenton Strange and Theo Johnson, both of those guys, you want to talk about dynamic personalities. I mean, those guys, knew how to conduct an interview, and you have to imagine that carried over, into that tight ends room.
And Pat Fryermuth did, and Mike Gesicki did too. I mean,
I was talking specifically about the guys he played with, though. But yeah, I mean, that's a great point that it didn't just start with Strange. It's been this thing that's been kind of passed along. So that's the one thing that's kind of left for him to do. And I think you talked to Ty Howell down at the bowl game, and I think he touched on that's kind of the next part of his development. So. That's really, all the tools are there. You stand next to this guy. I mean, he's big, he's strong, he's fast. I go back to the NFL Combine when, you're watching Theo Johnson and Ian Rappaport of the NFL Network is saying, the guy to keep an eye on at Penn State is number 44. Didn't even know his name. Yeah. And I think Rappaport did the same thing on a conference call with reporters. And, that guy has no skin in the game. I mean, it's not like he's it's not like he's a Tyler Warren fan or something. I mean, that's coming from an expert, a well-respected expert who knows, kind of what works at that next level. So I'm with you, Tyler. I think this is a great opportunity. And I think it's really smart of them to pick Tyler Warren as a guy to go out and kind of be a face of the program and be a guy who is talking. And I think it's going to be important for his teammates to see him doing that, because again, you look at the only part that's been missing from his game, and that's not being critical. Different people are different. I mean, some people are real comfortable with the media. Some people are real comfortable being vocal leaders. Some people are more, lead by example. Different things work, but I think when you're the guy in that room, and that's not to discount anybody else in that room, but the last few years, we've had like 1 and 1A tight ends, if not 1A and 1B. And now I think it's 1. And then, the rest of the guys, some of whom have the opportunity to be really, really good, but they're not quite there yet. So it's important for Tyler Warren. Hey, one other thing about Franklin that I wanted to mention, we definitely have to ask him about recruiting. And, some people a little nervous that they haven't done what some people think they need to do in the state of Pennsylvania. Brian Doan addressed that in a really good piece, but just Franklin's thoughts on that. So I didn't want to veer too far off before circling back to that. We will not, people, forget about asking Franklin about recruiting.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And so again, we'll report back from Indianapolis. We'll have a bunch of coverage at lions247.com. We'll bring you an episode before we get back on a plane and come to Pennsylvania, and break down what we experienced, what we encountered out there, what stood out. Daniel, anything for you? I mean, folks who have listened to this podcast have probably heard Devon J. Thomas, again, Devon Elise, previously known as. He's a guy that's going to be really, I think, introspective about his journey and really do a great job of discussing where this defense is. And Jalen Reed, to me, is again, in some ways like Tyler Warren, this is stepping into a different level of spotlight. But I think he's the guy that can really convince people maybe that, yeah, we lost these guys from the cornerback. We lost these guys from the edge room. We lost some veterans. But here's what we have. I think both of these players are going to really do a great job of being ambassadors for the defense and really mentioning a lot of their teammates. So what stands out to you from this group that we haven't hit on, and before we get to another subject?
I think with Jalen Reed and Devon, they're both at positions that had a lot of changes or kind of, some interesting personnel moves this offseason. With Devon, he's back for a 6th year. Hakeem Beamon is back for a 6th year. Smith Vilvert's back for a 6th year. And then you've got 4 true freshman defensive tackles who enrolled in January. I talked to Deion Barnes a little bit about it last month, and kind of having that, full spectrum. I don't know how old some of these guys are, but you've maybe got 23, 24-year-olds with 17 and 18-year-olds. That's a pretty significant gap in, age and life experience. And so, that I think is an interesting kind of meshing together there. And then also Devon is in the room with guys like Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton, Amin Vanover. I think that getting insight on how that defensive end group is coming together after losing 2 draft picks, I think could be really interesting and informative. And then it's similar on the back end, with Jalen Reed. You had your top 3 cornerbacks go to the NFL. You brought in 2 transfers in AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber. Audavian Collins was a breakout performer. You've got a bunch of freshmen in that cornerback room. I think Jalen Reed can give some good insight there. And then on top of that, we're still kind of learning what the mechanics of this defense are going to look like, with the Lions spot, with maybe being in a 4-2-5 a little bit more as a base. I think that we got some good information from Terry Smith on how it might actually operate in terms of who will be that 5th defensive back, depending on the situation. And so, I think kind of now having that, now asking a player about that and getting a little bit more into the nitty gritty of that, I think could be really interesting. And Jalen Reed is regarded as a really, really good processor from the mental side. And so, to be able to pick the brain of someone on a little bit of X's and O's and get some explanations, I think could be really, really informative and really, really useful for us. Over the course of stuff that we can apply all season long that we get now in Indianapolis.
We have so much, hear so much about the football IQ for Jalen Reed, and we also hear a lot about how he fits that line position, how he's the leader at that line position. So a lot to catch up with him, with Devon J. Thomas, with Tyler Warren out in Indianapolis. As we said, James Franklin, Pat Kraft also going to be part of the conversation out there too. So follow our coverage over at lions247.com. We'll get back to you with another episode later this week and circle back. Going over to the basketball conversation now that we promised early on. You guys were back and seeing Penn State in some form of action. We're not quite into preseason mode for them yet, but getting some new faces in new places here in Happy Valley because the transfer portal struck, and you got these guys who have some experience on other campuses. Mark, I'm curious, when you guys were able to, I think it was last Thursday afternoon, to see this 2024-2025 Penn State basketball program, what are the immediate takeaways? I know Daniel had notes for our VIP subscribers on the site really quickly. I know we have photo gallery and a lot more over at the site, but when you were walking off the court and you were just kind of digesting what you witnessed, what was on the top of your head?
I think there's just more overall size on this team. And, obviously last year they had Cudis, and, there wasn't a whole lot else going on, behind him, unfortunately, whether it was due to injury or guys just not coming along. But, you look at Kachi and you look at Niederhauser. Kachi is like, he's like 6'8", but he has a 7'4" wingspan, just ridiculously long arms. And, Niederheiser, they listed him at 7 foot, and I was a little bit dubious about that. A lot of guys are listed at 7 feet, and you get up next to him, it's like, yeah, this dude's 7 feet. He is. I mean, he is a huge human being. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to see Miles Goodman, the true freshman, highly regarded. I think a 4-star. Daniel, am I right on that? His arm was in a sling. Hopefully, that's nothing that's going to last for a long time. But it even went down, to other positions. I mean, Freddie DeLeon, the transfer from Tennessee, he's listed at 6'5". Again, I had an opportunity, and I'll get something together on him to go over and interview him one-on-one. And, he's a legit 6'5", and, has good length to him. Puff Johnson, who's returning, just looked like he bulked up a little bit. So I just think overall it looks like they have a little bit more size. But then you go to like Ace Baldwin, who I always forget how small he is, but obviously he's a hell of a player, Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. So size isn't everything, but I think if you looked at last year's team, sometimes that was a big disadvantage for them. And I think overall this year they're going to be more equipped to compete against some of the larger teams in the Big Ten, just because I think they're a little bit bigger across the board.
In terms of guys that you had seen for the first time here, Daniel, in Penn State uniform, what stood out to you in that regard?
Yeah, I got a second mark on Yannick Niederhauser, just being a legit 7 feet tall. He's standing next to Brent Scott, the assistant coach, who was listed at 6'10" in his playing career. And, when Brent Scott was standing next to Qudus Wahab or Favor Ire or Demetrius Lilly last year, he was the bigger guy for the most part. But, next to Niederhauser, I mean, it's legit. That's a real seven footer. He's well regarded for his passing, so I'm really excited to see what that actually looks like. But in terms of some of the other guys, I mean, getting eyes on Dominic Stewart and Javin Carter, those additions, true freshman additions in the backcourt, I thought was really good to see. Stewart, he had a really nice dunk during some individual work. I don't know if we were necessarily expecting to see that kind of athleticism out there. You could tell that he was taking everything in. He had the wide-eyed look. It wasn't really a deer in the headlights, but it was, he was drinking from the fire hose. Every single thing that, was being said to him, he was trying to process and then apply it right away, which you want to see from a freshman. Javin Carter looked really, really smooth. I think that he's someone that, can be that, can be that backup point guard, can be that secondary ball handler that Penn State didn't necessarily have at times last year, especially after Kanye Clary got booted from the team. And so I think that Carter is someone who has a really interesting backstory as a 4-year player at a public school in his hometown in Tennessee. Didn't transfer, didn't get plucked by a basketball powerhouse, and then comes here and can have an opportunity to play. I think that is going to be something that I'm going to keep an eye on. Hudson Ward is someone I'm really intrigued by. I didn't keep my eye on him for too much last Thursday, but we're going to get 2 more looks at these guys before the end of the summer. And so I've got Ward, the freshman from Canada, who was the last addition to this recruiting class. He's someone that, I'll have my eye on, and I'm really curious to see.
Mark, unlike last summer, this is actually a team that carries continuity through the offseason in the form of its players and with the coaching staff. And so I know it's difficult to see that when you're just poking your head into an offseason session like this, but is that continuity apparent in any way for you guys?
Absolutely.
And what do you make of the fact that they do have this nucleus that has been through it together?
Yeah, we were fortunate that while we were there, they worked on their press. And you could really see it there. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, obviously, Ace is at the head of that snake, right? I mean, he's going to be the guy who's up there. But I was actually right down there, and our photographer was right next to me, where they were inbounding the ball. And to see, you have the 5 guys returning from last year, obviously led by Ace. And then, was it 8 other guys? Daniel, am I right about that? 8 other scholarship guys, 8 newcomers. And to see them in that atmosphere where the guys who are back know exactly what to do. And the new guys, you could see there was some real confusion there. I mean, Rhodes does some high level stuff. And when you're right down there and you hear them calling it out, I was trying to be careful with what I posted video wise, because I didn't want to give away any strategy or anything. But the simple, I'm trying to give a good example with, it was Stewart once and it was DeLeon another time, where they weren't in the position that they needed to be. And, with Stewart, he basically is like, no, you got to get over here. He blows the whistle and you got to stand right here in the lane. This is where you need to be. And with DeLeon, it was like, as the drill's going, he's like waving, no, you got to get here. He's out on the court. And then you see the other players explaining what's going on as well. So to have that sort of continuity in this system, I think is gigantic. I mean, if you think back to last year, obviously they had Ace and who am I drawing a blank on, Daniel, from VCU?
Nick Kern.
Kern, yeah, I'm sorry. So you had two guys who had played in that system, but it's a whole different thing having two guys than having five guys to show you how to go through this stuff. So I thought that was like a really cool glimpse. And I was so glad, because sometimes you go to these things and it's like layup lines and, whatever else. We saw some legit stuff. And to me, that really just pointed out, and then you hear when they're going through stuff, they did I think it was a 4-on-4 drill near the end when we were there. And to hear the veteran players communicating during the drill with the new players just kind of speaks to what you were saying. So, yeah, I mean, that's a great point that you brought up, Tyler, and it was really cool to see.
Daniel, let's finish the discussion here. Either a player or an athlete of this current Penn State team that you find yourself being higher on going into the last week of July than you were, let's say, the end of the spring?
Yeah, I mean, I think to go back what Mark was talking about earlier with the size, I think that you have it, and it's not just size for size's sake. It's guys who look like they have skills, who look like they can do different things. I thought it was interesting that Puff Johnson, who's listed as a guard forward on the roster, he was working with the bigs. He was with Niederhauser and Kachi with Miles Goodman watching, while Brent Scott was working with them when we were in there. I thought that was a little bit interesting to see. But I think you feel a little bit better about it. Like Mark said, you had Kudus last year, and outside of I think it was like 8 games where Demetrius Lilly was healthy and was really looking like he was taking major steps forward. Outside of that, you didn't get much from that second big spot. And then I think that Ace Baldwin, being able to level up. I mean, I was high on him going into last year. I was high on him coming out of last year, but in hearing Rhodes talk about him, Rhodes said that this is the best that he's ever seen Ace in terms of how he's working off the court, how he's working on the court. And, that's a 5th-year senior. Mike Rhodes has known him for a long, long time. Coached him all 5 years. And, Ace told us that, after last year, he kind of knew what the Big Ten was. He knew what he needed to do to, kind of raise his game within the conference. And that's what he's trying to do this offseason. He said he's doing 2-a-days and 3-a-days. Jamal Brunt, the associate head coach, spoke to us, and, he had a story about how, Baldwin will come in and do his individual workout or his group workout, and then, some freshmen will come in for their workout, or the other newcomers will come in to work out, and Baldwin will stick around and do their workout with them or help them with their workout. I think that's kind of what you want to see from someone in that position. He closed the year last year really, really strong. And so now it's kind of a question of, spinning that forward and starting the year at that level and keeping that level for a full season. So I think that, you look at the size, I'm impressed with it. We'll see once you get in there into the season and you're actually banging with opponents, how that translates. And I think having Ace Baldwin, maybe a little bit up another level, I think could be big for that team as well.
Hopefully folks caught our episode. We had John Hara on the show not too long ago. I think it was 3 episodes ago, previewing his upcoming reunion with Penn State basketball teammates. with the Happy Valley Hoopers for the basketball tournament, as it's labeled, $1 million prize. They started off their journey in that tournament on Saturday afternoon with the victory in Pittsburgh. I know by the time folks listen to this episode, their second game will probably already have been played. It's scheduled for Monday at 6 p.m. with a team stacked with UConn alumni. That's games out in Pittsburgh as well. But you guys, before they went out and played games, and after we heard from John on the podcast, you were able to see some practice action, Mark, and we had a photo gallery over at Lions247.com. I know these guys were also strapping it up with some current members of the team as well. What stands out to you seeing the band get back together in some ways, including guys who didn't finish off their college career in Nittany Lions uniforms?
Yeah, I did not get a chance to go over there. The intern did and took photos. One thing she said, it was very cool. A bunch of these players came over, even the guys who left, like Sam Sessoms and Myron Jones were coming over and like, oh, it's so great to see you. I think that's one of the cool things is that, there was a time where if a guy transferred, you might not see him back. I go back to John Crispin, who was part of that 2001 NCAA team and then ended up transferring to UCLA. And it was misguided on his part, but he felt like he couldn't come back for years because nobody liked him, which couldn't have been further from the truth. And now he's back every year at Coaches versus Cancer. But there used to be kind of this stigma where if you transferred, it just wasn't a good feel. And that is absolutely not the case here. I mean, we saw Jamari Wheeler with his team last year. I guess he's technically on the roster, Daniel. I don't know. Is he? Isn't he? But Sessoms, it sounds like Brockington is going to play in Monday's game. Myron Jones, who went to Florida. Brockington obviously went to Iowa State. Myron Jones, who went to Florida. Trent Buttrick, who went to UMass. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody. But you know who the key to all of this is. It's John Hara, because he's like the Pied Piper. These guys, you have guys who played for all these different coaches. And Hara, I was telling you guys this story. I remember when he was a freshman on that NIT championship team, and he actually ended up starting late in the year because Mike Watkins was banged up, and they were playing so well that even when Watkins came back, they kept him in the starting lineup. And in the NIT and at the Big Ten tournament that year, they had open locker rooms. And Hara was like really nervous talking to the media. And now you see him a few years, not a few years later. What is it, 7 years later? And you have him on the pod. And, you could just tell that people are kind of drawn to him. And that's how we got into getting him on the pod is I saw him at Coaches versus Cancer, and he started explaining the story to me. I said, well, don't explain it to me. We got to get you on the pod. And so that's what I think it's all about. It's like these guys have remained friends. Myron and John did a podcast together, for a while, even after Myron left. So I just think it's cool to see that even with all the turmoil with Penn State hoops and guys leaving and people upset with the AD at the time, Sandy Barber, they remain tight. And to see them go out and do some things last year, obviously it wasn't tremendously well organized. Mike Watkins didn't play really well. John was hurt. He couldn't even play. This year, he went at it, I think, with his eyes a little bit more wide open, had a better feel for how to build the roster, and it got them through that first game at least. And that was with John Hara as their only legit big man. That's not a knock on Buttrick. He's just not a post player. I mean, he's more of a stretch wing. So Qudus Wahab was on the roster. I think if he plays, they have a chance to do some things. If not, again, I'm not sure when people are going to be watching this. That UConn team is really big, so it could be a little bit of a challenge. But it's fun to see. John Hara, good guy, obviously kind of the Pied Piper of that team.
Yeah, general manager, but also getting it done on the hardwood. Double in that round one victory, 11 points, 14 rebounds. He's playing professionally in Japan. So if you missed that conversation from earlier this month, I'd encourage you to check that one out. Fun one. We talked about his Philadelphia Eagles tryout. We talked about James Franklin reaching out to the staff about maybe him playing some football. A lot of different topics touched on that one. I want to circle back and finish this episode, guys, by asking, when it comes to non-Penn State related stuff we're going to hear about in Indianapolis, and believe it or not, there's going to be a lot of that out there we're going to encounter. 17 other programs represented. Clearly, though, there are some storylines above the other. Daniel, we'll start with you. I'll throw it back over to you, Mark, after him. What is the non-Penn State football storyline that intrigues you most out there we're going to hear about from this conference?
I think the easiest one to go to is the 4 new teams coming in and where they are, where they kind of stack up. You looked at those preseason polls this morning, or that came out Monday morning. Oregon was in there at number 2 behind Ohio State. I think that people are really, really impressed with that program. I think that even though they have a new quarterback in Dylan Gabriel, people saw what Bo Nix did last year, and they expect kind of a similar, plug and play. We know that that's not always how things work out, but on paper, the Ducks look really, really good. And then the rest of the 3 that are coming in are all in kind of various states of flux. Washington lost their coach, their staff, a ton of people from that runner-up national championship team from last year. So where are they going to be? How are they coming into the season? How are they dealing with that adjustment? UCLA lost their coach really late to become an offensive coordinator in the same conference with Chip Kelly leaving for Ohio State. I think that Deshaun Foster was a pretty savvy hire and someone who I think can generate some excitement for the Bruins, but they're going to be undergoing all those changes coming into a new league. And then you have USC where they don't have a new coach, they don't have these big overhauls. They are losing Caleb Williams, so that is kind of a big deal when you have a quarterback of that caliber move on. But I think a lot of people are just kind of waiting to see, is this team legit? Can they play in the Big Ten? Can they avoid letdowns? I think that's kind of defined, this Lincoln Riley, brief Lincoln Riley era out at USC, is that, it's just kind of hasn't totally been there completely, especially when you look at what's happened on the defensive side of the ball. They've addressed it, but what is that going to look like? So I think those 4 teams, coming in, I know I got the easy one in my pick here, but I'm really curious to hear from those teams, hear what the current Big Ten programs think about these new ones coming in, and what this really looks like when the season starts.
Penn State draws 3 of those Pac-12 transplants, not Oregon, which is considered the heavyweight of that group here in 2024, but USC. They're going to host the Nittany Lions in October. Penn State will welcome UCLA and Washington. That's the whiteout game during this fall. Mark, obviously, that's some obvious territory there. We're all curious what we're going to hear there. I think that it's Brave New World with the Big Ten, so we'll dive into that when we get there. But beyond the expansion, what piques your interest?
Well, I did want to touch on something with the expansion, sure. And it's what kind of media coverage is there going to be from those beats?
Yeah.
You go out to this thing and there'll be, 400 people covering Ohio State, and there'll be, nobody covering Maryland, you know what I mean? Or one person. So it really gives you a feel for what sort of interest there is. This is where the rubber, again, kind of meets the road for a lot of media outlets. We're going to get a feel for, it's kind of a new era. I mean, imagine covering those teams. It's going to be difficult, and you have to figure out how to use your resources. And I wonder how many of them are going to be willing to come to an event like this that, frankly, the Big Ten scheduled this. The schedule got out late. There's a major conference in town. Very difficult to get hotel rooms, as you guys know, right? And, they made it about as difficult as possible to cover this thing. We literally just got the media schedule as we were recording this podcast, a day before it starts. So welcome to the Big Ten. All you beat people from the Pac-12. This is the way it works. So honestly, just to see how many people from these different beats show up. Beyond that, I think just what is the general feel for the college football playoff, the expansion, and are people looking at things maybe a little bit differently in terms of scheduling and whatever, and now that many more teams are going to make it into the playoffs. And I think obviously a theme is going to be, and I'm surprised Daniel didn't mention this with Jalen Reed, the NCAA video game. And this may sound goofy, but we have already seen Penn State players complaining about their rankings and stuff. And I wonder, I wonder what coaches are thinking about this, because
we spent 45 minutes on this podcast last week talking about these ratings. So yeah,
right. But it's like, what are players thinking when you have, or what are coaches thinking when you have players who are so distracted that they didn't get whatever rating, or I'm going to post my 40 time because you didn't rate me as being fast enough, or you had Jalen Reed who didn't submit his information, and Penn State's taking a hit for it, right, Daniel? That Penn State would be better in the game. Jalen, why didn't you submit your stuff? So that may sound goofy, but it's people are talking about it, and players are super, super, super interested in it.
Well, to me, maybe we buried the lead a little bit, but Ohio State, Michigan, it's still the Big Ten Conference, and these are two programs coming off very different off seasons. Get your popcorn ready moment the last several summers at this event was when Jim Harbaugh would take the podium, because you never knew where the conversation would turn. And now what are we going to hear from Michigan's head coach, from Michigan's players after what took place last year, after winning the national championship and being able to back up some of the bravado we've heard in recent summers? And then Ohio State, they have approached things very differently in the way they've put together this roster. A lot of finances involved. Ryan Day must be feeling this is the year to make a move. So I think those two programs, as usual, will garner their share of the spotlight. But it's a big conference. This is a 3-day event now instead of a 2-day event. We will get our opportunity to speak with Penn State players, coaches on Wednesday. So that's when you can really lock into Lions 24/7. But we get out to Indianapolis on Tuesday. We're expecting to hear from Pat Kraft, the athletic director, pretty quickly as we get situated out in Indianapolis. So look for coverage starting on Tuesday, continuing through the end of the week. Thanks for joining us for this podcast on a Monday. Daniel, Mark, I'm sad we aren't all going to be traveling there together, but we'll be regrouping on the practice field in less than 2 weeks for preseason practice coverage. So be seeing a lot of you both soon.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right, good stuff from those guys. As promised, we'll come back with a second episode later this week from Indianapolis, giving you plenty of feedback on what we heard, saw, experienced out there among Big Ten players, coaches, and fellow reporters, which can also be a pretty insightful part of that process as well. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. Tune into our coverage at lions247.com and follow us here on the podcast, whether you are at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or over on YouTube, where you can catch videos of each and every episode. Talk to you soon.